Schoi blei, dit se desarmen virnen redola reins. Rebroiklem presiburmern sitamens, save tupfene me revrusher. AKA.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Ŋa. So today we're going to be taking a look at one of the last big languages important to the world of the Dog Days comic that I'm working on. We've looked at Arodjun, there's a book on Arodjun, we've looked at Pitham, Hvasvan, Nashan, and Pirnshex, and today we're going to be looking at the language of the Prins Empire, the Prince language, Pirnshex, as it would be said by a Prince speaker. Now, not only has this language spread throughout the Western continent, but it's also given lots of loanwords and even grammatical influence to modern Arodjun. So let's dive into this very important language for this world. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for future developments in this world, and like the video to give me that sweet, juicy algorithm juice. Anyway, let's begin.
So, Prince, pronounced endonymically as Pirnshex, is yet another Sern-Cahilan language, descended from the Hvasvan, Proto-Sern-Cahilan culture, in the 4700s BR. Now, the iteration of the language discussed in this showcase will be what is known as Imperial Prince, which was spoken in the 1200s through 1500s AR, up to 800 years before the time of the Dog Days comic. So, some of the standout features we'll be going over include R harmony, verbs which conjugate for the subject and inflect for the gender of the object, a relatively small phonology compared to that of its sister language or cousin language, Nashan, whatever you want to call it, and some fascinating grammatical constructions and more that we're going to get into. But first, the history, as always. So Prince descends from the Sern eastern branch of the Hvasvan people, the Proto-Sern-Cahilans. It followed the same evolutionary path as Nashan for thousands of years. The Proto-Sern and later Proto-Nashans migrated around what is today the southeastern United States for thousands of years, before finally settling around our days Georgia and Florida around the 900s before the Rediscovery. The Proto-Nashans interacted significantly with the previous people groups of the region who spoke Prnth languages, aka languages from the same ancient language family as Pitham, see that showcase. The Proto-Nashans in the south mixed with and eventually supplanted the Prnth people, while the further north the cultural exchange was, the more even and significant it was. These northern Proto-Nashan groups then began to diverge from those in the south as they utilized the infrastructure from the former Lrnath, Prnth-speaking empire, and mixed linguistically and culturally with their descendants. Our name of the language family, Pernth, actually shares an etymology with Prince, despite the upcoming Prince language still, obviously, most definitely being a Sern-Cahilan language. After the rediscovery of ancient human technology further north in the Sern lands, the Prince were some of the first to gain access to human energy, ideas, and weaponry. This gave them the final push required to create a strong state that pushed the Nashans further south. The Prince and Sern civilizations became more powerful as they shared technology and infrastructure with one another. By 600 AR, early Prince was definitively a different language from Old Nashan, and there was no going back. The Prince Confederation became the first Prince Federation in 783 AR, and by the 900s, the Prince Federation had the highest standard of living in all of the world, with education and literacy rates higher than anywhere else. After a period of decline led to civil war and decentralization over the 1100s, the authoritarian Prins Empire formed under the strong leadership of Prince Hvasvan. After Hvasvan's ascent, the fortification of language and culture became extremely regulated. The force of prescriptivism was strong, and a standardized imperial Prince dialect was made official with dictionaries and spelling reforms, etc. by the early 1200s. 2 generations after this, it looked like decline was imminent again, so the Prince began to look outward. The Prins Empire then used its newfound naval supremacy and advanced technology, including some of the first reverse-engineered airplanes, to set up colonies along the coastlines of the western continent. Their biggest fight was against the entire land of Joan, where modern day like Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, etc. is. You can see it on the map to the left. After conquering Joan and building railroads to cross to the Pacific Ocean, the conquest continued on the Pacific coast. Eventually, the Prince would conquer much of the Fwonnel Peninsula, Clio, and even as far north as the Okrova Island in Alka. So, we're going to be going over the phonology, phonotactics, some elements of its descent from Hvasvan, the orthography, some basic grammatical structures, and some other weird quirks and features that make Prnth interesting. And then we're going to go on to the sample text. If you notice similarities between this language and Nashan, that is definitely not a coincidence. Nashan and Prnth are, I don't know, I called them sisters earlier, but first cousins is probably a better term for it. Both are descendants of old Nashara, and you'll likely be able to see these similarities at least occasionally if you remember anything from the Nashan video. So first, the consonants are pa, ba, ta, da, ka, ga, fa, va, sa, za, sha, sha, ha, ra, ya, wa, ma, na, la. Very simple. Pretty much all of them also appear in English in one way or another. The romanization, not too much need to be done. It's relatively similar to the IPA transcription. Sha is SH, Ja is ZH, Ra is just the letter R, and Ka is with the letter C, just for aesthetics. Yeah, there's a couple slight differences for the vowels as well that you'll see in the next slide. Our vowels are I, E, A, U, and O, along with the diphthongs O, Ow, A, I, O, Ui. And as you can see, the romanization just turns the I into a normal letter I, the E into a normal letter E, A into the diphthong AE, which could be confused for a diphthong, but it's not. It's just a quirk in the romanization. I didn't feel like using any diacritics or the actual A symbol or any of that, so moving on. So the syllable structure for Prnth goes as follows. CLVVLF, right? Where C represents any consonant, L represents the liquids, ra, la, wa, and ya, V is for vowels, and F is all fricatives. So both Prnth and Nashan are distantly related to Hvasvan, and thus Arodjun as well, over thousands of years and a lot of miles of difference. You can see in the table below the same set of roots that I've shown in all my past showcases in this world. Some of the roots have changed to be completely unrecognizable from Hvasvan, which is to be expected due to the massive difference in time. Some of them have stayed relatively consistent, assisting in-world linguists in discovering the broader language family connections to the continent. Now on to the orthography. Very nice. The Prnth writing system is an alphabet that descends directly from the predecessor to the Nashan alphabet that you saw in the Nashan video. The system looks quite different from Nashan's cursive writing though, and it lacks any archaic tone markings. Its consistency was crafted by design by the Imperial Prince government in the late 1100s AR as part of their prescriptivist mission to unify the people under one system of education. It's read left to right, and it even features some evidence of inspiration from the ancient Lrnath abjad in a few of its consonants. Also, a similar numeral system to that of the Nashans was developed, however it was converted to a base 10 system in writing during the Great Standardization event. So when you're writing Prnth, the most complicated part of its spelling relates to stress marking. In a way, it's weird. If the stress syllable of a word is not R-colored or followed by a post-nuclear L, or L-colored if you want to call it that, then the nucleus is marked with a letter X in the romanization and with a special ligature in the orthography. Every vowel has an R-colored and an X-stressed variant in the orthography. Remember, the X isn't actually pronounced, it is just to mark irregular stress. How do you determine the primary stress in a noun, adjective, or adverb in Prnth? It just takes a few simple steps to understand, except for the irregulars, of which there are many, so watch out for that. Essentially, it all depends on the contents of the root word. If one of the syllables in the root word is R-colored, then that gets the primary stress. If two or more syllables in the root are R-colored, then the stress goes to the first one. If none of that applies, then look at the historical development of the language to check for vowels that historically were articulated with the falling tone, marked in the phonemic transcription on my document with a grave diacritic. Any syllable with a former falling tone cannot be stressed. If all the syllables in a root word have the falling tone markers, then stress the first one. And if none of any of that applies, then stress defaults to the first syllable in two-syllable roots and to the second syllable for roots with 3 or more syllables. Simple, right? Basically, if you're not a native speaker, this is going to be a game of memorization, because again, there's several irregulars, especially in more common nouns. And a lot of those will have the letter X on them in the romanization, and will have the ligature on them in the orthography. But not all the time, so be careful of that. Now for verbs, the process is pretty similar. You'll note that whichever syllable nucleus gets the primary stress is the one that'll be conjugated for tense and person in the verbs, as we get to that part later. R-colored nuclei get the priority, of course, followed by the first non-short and non-falling syllable in the word. If there are no distinctions of any of these sorts, then the first syllable of the root gets the primary stress. Pretty simple, right? Except for the irregulars. The stress marking for the romanization. In the orthography, you're going to see that the special X ligatures are used to denote the non-R colored and non-L colored irregular stress markings in a word. As you see in the examples below, not all stressed syllables without the RL get the X marker. Like the word sisprit, which means wait, for example, doesn't need an X because the historical falling tone on the I makes it intuitive for a native speaker to not require any special markings, something they'd learn in school. However, the word beletai does contain an X because there's nothing obvious in the root that would tell a speaker where the stress belongs. Just think of it like the special acutes that are put on vowels in Spanish when the stress is irregular, except it's with a letter X. Very fun. So, one of the most important things to take note of whenever you're listening to, speaking, reading prints is R coloring and R harmony. So R coloring is when an entire vowel or an entire diphthong becomes rhoticized. And this can happen to every vowel, every diphthong, there's no exceptions. In the orthography, it's written with a special ligature for each vowel. And in the romanization, it's written with a letter R, immediately following the vowel or vowel cluster that's being rhoticized. R coloring can occur naturally in a word due to presence in the root, or it can alter a noun as it becomes plural, or a couple other situations. When an R-colored vowel becomes present in a word, every syllable following said vowel will also be R-colored, unless it's interrupted by an X syllable, an irregular stress. The irregular stress can break the R harmony for the rest of the word. It actually happens quite a lot. For example, the word bavin means governor, and it does share an etymology with the Arodjun word for bez, balance, if you're interested. And you can see that its plural form is rebarvern. The root, bav, is one syllable, with the en ending being the immovable gender appended to an originally movable root. So, this is technically irregular, but I think it gets the point across. It follows the pluralization rules just right. Next, you have the word bedibde, which means a column of smoke. And then you have its plural form, berdibde, columns of smoke. Notice how the X stress marker prevents the R harmony from reaching the end of the word. And then finally, there's apfe, which means duck, and its plural form, rubfer. If you remember the Nashan showcase, you'll notice that this is not at all the same system of pluralizing nouns. In fact, this one is much simpler than Nashan's system. This R harmony plural system is likely one of the biggest impacts of the northern Proto-Nashans living within the Sprachbund of the Lrnath, while the southern Proto-Nashans were able to avoid this influence and keep the system more akin to the Hvasvan system of pluralization. So now you know how to mark plurals in Prnth, so let's get on to the rest of the morphology. So, onto these more core bits of morphology. Prnth has 4 distinct cases and 2 grammatical genders, those being immovable and movable. The nouns can be verbalized, verbs can be nominalized, there's several nice prefixes and suffixes that can change the meaning of words.
Much of this will likely look like a simplified version of how Old Nashara and thus Nashan worked. You'll see. The 4 cases in Prnth are subjective-objective, genitive, causative or adjective, and allative. You'll see the subjective-objective table is the basis of grammatical gender, as expressed with the unmarked form of the root. The general rule for grammatical gender can be seen in the final consonant of the root word. Plosives R, N, and H are most likely to become immovable nouns, while fricatives L and J and W are likely to become movable nouns. Exceptions to this rule are plentiful, so don't get too comfortable. Also, purposeful inversions of a word's original gender can change its connotation and even definition, and those ones are everywhere as well, so it'll keep you on your toes. But there is a standard underlying strategy for defining the gender. These genders are descended from the inanimate object and adult genders from Hvasvan, respectively. As the Hvasvan gender system simplified, immovable and movable became the only survivors. As with many societies interpreting their grammatical genders, the early Prnths adopted these genders from their ancestors with their theorized meanings, those being immovable and movable. Now, a movable noun is considered one that is more likely to change, move, or waver, while an immovable noun is one that is more likely to be static, permanent, unchanging, or strong. Now, if you're describing a person and you want them to appear more strong, you can change movable inflections to immovable inflections, hopefully without changing the meaning of a word. If you refer to something that is a force of nature using a movable gender, you might be putting it into a more spiritual or religious context, or giving it anthropomorphic qualities. So there's a lot of fun things you can do with it. You can strengthen or weaken people in positions of power, blah blah blah. It's just, it leads to a lot of fun misunderstandings that can happen. Just like in a lot of real world languages. It's pretty fun, you'll see. Now for the articles, there are definite, indefinite, proximal, and distal articles that can be seen in immovable and movable forms. They can be used for any nouns that you want, but most of the time speakers will only use articles on plural nouns. You can still use them with singular nouns for emphasis, education, or clarification though. So, for example, you have the word reciberns, which means the texture. May ribidbi, some bushes. Re rebarvern, some governors. So here's the pronoun table for Prnth. I know it took a while to get to this point, but these pronouns are very similar to Nashan and are also eventually derived from the Hvasvan pronouns. Frequently, these pronouns will be pro-dropped. Most sentences, actually. Most of the time it gets pro-dropped. Now here's a list of some of the most common Prnth affixes. If you watch my channel for a while, you might notice that some of these affixes are direct ancestors to those used in modern Arodjun. Also, this is the origin of the demonym for the people of Fwonnel. It comes from the Prnth word, Fwonnel. As you can see, the L is one of the demonymic suffixes for a movable noun. They considered Fwon itself to be movable. Also, the English term that I use, Princi, for the collective form of the Prnth civilization, comes from the immovable demonym for the people of the Prnths. Prnths becomes Prnci. Okay, now it's time to get into some grammar. The word order is most frequently the classic SVO for positive statements, though poetry often breaks this rule, and it can still generally be understood. For questions and negative statements, you'll do S, then a particle, then OV most of the time. This is similar to how Nashan works as well. Similar to Nashan, verbs are conjugated for transitivity and gender of the object, using prefixes and suffixes to explain it. More similar to Prnth languages like Python though, the verbs are conjugated for the person and the tense of the subject by altering internal vowels. Intransitive verbs don't really need any conjugation for any objects, and thus they're only represented with the prefix I or il. The table you'll see on the right here is a set of some very common particles that appear before verbs conjugated in the conditional tense. I say tense with implied quotation marks. The particle we also occasionally appears before infinitive verbs as a sort of filler to word. So here's a simple sentence in Prnth. I touch it, which would be Wartsabarmenrin. This contains the pronouns for I and it, but
You probably won't need either of them in a real conversation. You're most likely to just say "subarmern," as that verb there contains as much information as your listener likely needs to know in order to understand what's going on. I touch something immovable is what that means, and that's probably good enough for all your conversations. So there's 6 major prepositions: vir, hal, lol, tur, and say. When paired with nouns in different cases, they can change the meaning to one of several senses. Now, hal, before a subjective-objective noun, essentially creates a comminative case. Paired with a causative noun, creates the sense of an ablative case, and so on. The only ones that are like kind of ungrammatical and weird are the ones that are highlighted in kind of the reddish color. And then finally, here's a few last points that didn't make it into the previous sections. When we get the big example text, you'll see a lot of vir plus a genitive pronoun plus a verb combos. And these are perfective constructions. Also, the word om has many uses, but it can mostly be thought of as has or have, or just a particle of essence. If you see a sentence like x om y, it basically is saying that x has or contains y-ness. That's how most copulas are formed. Now, clauses are split and subordinated with the particles when, which kind of means that, and pre, which can best be translated as which, I guess. You might see these used in Arodjun as well in related ways. Wink, wink. And so that was the bulk of the grammar, and now it's time for a nice classic example text. So the following text is a letter between 2 officials of Soterval, or Arodjanza, from Rinor the Prince Colonial Governor, to Elasoilo, the Superintendent of Education, regarding the improper use of numbers by Arodjans and students and workers in 1304 AR. Iva vir Elasoilo, Selitse vitoe vafiter. Lrnath rirfar ar kamen om vi human when sharpal resormers om vi itun lol res aloy lor ditpre I paum lol ever tartar se vi blairs im sharp clorpers per pitten vir duns al sharplar se plermen lolir gitsen lotsen when a gap rebeshen kalorser se ramen luporama edel me shows of a fit ever gider bresh hal war garter lol vira shoes and gesursun when a hotaker tarmala na pirtsa reform we luitsen a slir shir nirlen fam lolre le doit I mirknas en abne sen siften berlive abne sits over sormer vi vor parker se vor roder se lol el vit seile we ytaimen ges have permen him et taver splerm vitava feter nir spirm lotsen vever we lublemen we son sort of valer vir vor milamen vir varishin or famen Fwonnel a vesh lotsem gesin soala. Sun resursil me repirkser with pive me lotse shor sorlar. Farton narpitser to a dieter ge kledum vir nen ruil birk. Sekunds baven renor tiva. Him believe nave I mirkner sen amne faf. Salven genarpitser fast in vir fikibren leninem ver lotsa wen ner ile felibrin taina. Alright, and there you go. That was it. The Prnth language. Again, the last big important language that I really needed to develop for the sake of my world building and stuff. Expect more videos on comparative linguistics and linguistic studies between these languages, interactions between the cultures, and overall dives into the world building as I get into actually finishing the episode of the comic, releasing that to the public and stuff. It's gonna be tasty. I'm so excited about this world, and I'm very hyped to finally be able to dive deeper into sharing it all with you. So if you're excited for that, definitely subscribe, maybe become a patron. Yeah, special thanks to all my patrons, my special natrons over on patreon.com/nga, who have helped me through all these chaotic toils and adventures that I go on throughout the weeks. Have fun with me on Discord, do all kinds of stuff. We're doing all kinds of activities, it's gonna be fun. Remember, the Conlang contest, the cursed Conlang circus, is still happening right now. You have until November 1st to submit
your most disturbing conlang monstrosities that you possibly can. Please, I've already seen a lot of submissions and they're looking real good so far, so if you want to get some prizes and be featured on a video and absolutely disgust people and potentially injure my vocal cords with your painful productions or awful grammar, then yeah, submit it. So I will see you all next time. Nga is out. Bye.